thank you everyone for joining us. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our subject matter expert today, and he will tell you, if you don't know him already, who he is and what we are here to discuss. So Tyler, take it away.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, everyone. Thank you for connecting and thank you for putting where you're from in the chat. I love that. It breaks the ice, gets the chat flowing. Please feel free to continue that trend for those of you that are just trickling in. My name is Tyler Shields. I'm a principal analyst at Enterprise Strategy Group, now a part of Omdia. My background is pretty different compared to most analysts. Historically, I come from actually a offensive security world where I was a cybersecurity penetration tester, R&D engineer for the first half of my career. Then somehow I managed to get into entrepreneurship and starting cyber startups and building them from scratch and was the CMO at a couple of successful cyber startups. And since then have gone back to a role that I really loved in my career as a market analyst. And I am an analyst now, as I mentioned, for ESG. Um, I also used to do a little bit of teaching at business school for entrepreneurship. So that's kind of me in a nutshell. What we will be focusing on today is some research that I recently released with the help of some sponsors such as Nucleus Security to help bring it to market. It's on threat and exposure management and specifically some of the gaps and difficulties that threat and exposure management processes and engineers and people run into. And so, yeah, I'm looking forward to presenting some of the results of that survey with you today.
All right. So thanks for that intro, and let's dive in. Um, I think Tyler already covered a bit of what we're talking about, but as Tyler mentioned, all of the data you're going to see today is based on this report. You can grab it through Nucleus, and maybe it's a good idea that we drop that in the chat for anyone who wants it. But you'll see a bunch of data points that we're bringing in. And one of the things that I like about ESG's reports, and this, the type, is that they really go out there and talk to practitioners, decision makers, real security people and what they're doing, how they're thinking, rather than, more vendor type of research, which is the more typical one that we see in the market. And I think this is the type of input that we need to actually make decisions about, understanding like where we're at, but also where we should be going as an industry. So let's jump right in with that. And the first question, because this is going to be our topic, is, what is threat and exposure management? Why are we even talking about, exposures and not vulnerabilities now?
Yeah, so there's a couple of very interesting things I want to bring up here. The first one is the difference between a vulnerability and exposure. A lot of people use that terminology interchangeably, and I don't. And I think the market shouldn't either, right? A vulnerability is really something that's like a first level problem, right? Meaning it is a problem in a piece of software, a code, a specific thing that has an issue that can be exploited directly within some code of some sort. Exposures are a bit different. You don't necessarily need a vulnerability to have an exposure. If I, put an S3 bucket out on the internet without encryption and without authentication, and my data is wide open for anyone to read, there's no vulnerability there. There's no CVE that I can attach to it, but there is an exposure of risk for my company, right? So the first thing I want people to understand is the difference between a vulnerability and an exposure and why we talk about exposure management. Exposure is a superset of vulnerability. So exposure would include vulnerabilities that you have because they add risk to the environment, but it's not in isolation. The other thing that you then kind of tease out when we talk about threat and exposure management is it's the combination of a few data sets, knowledge and I guess consumption and the ability to analyze and execute on three different data sets. It's the connection of knowing what you have in your environment, the asset base. And by asset base, I don't mean laptops, right? Although that is an asset, traditionally people have always thought of assets as something you put a sticker on, a physical item. We need to think of assets as something that's software defined and could be literally just about anything in your environment that you can draw a software box around, right? You have to be able to know what you have in that environment and then understand the state of those assets and what exposures exist within those asset sets. And that's traditionally where we've seen vulnerability management kind of stop. Then we want to connect to that threats because without a threat, an asset that has an exposure has zero risk if there's nobody actually attacking it, if there's no threat to it, right? And so it's threat and exposure management is the unification of these three data sets, allowing you to do analysis and ideally get actionable fixes out the other side of the process.
Okay. Um, this is something that we'll come back to later, but you mentioned assets, and I was just, going to bring up a couple of things. First of all, from a housekeeping perspective, if you got questions, there's a Q&A box. So please drop
Type them
questions
in.
and we will be answering them as we go along, as much as we can. You mentioned assets specifically, and I know we're going to talk about this in a bit, but what's an asset when you're talking about things like cloud, or what even is an asset, and why is
Yeah.
this, why are we even talking about this, when we're talking about vulnerability management?
Yeah, I mean, look, software in general, whether it's software that is infrastructure based or runs infrastructure, or whether it's custom code you're creating, or even thinking of things like identities or CSP accounts or CSP instances or workloads or containers, all of those things are assets. And the reason why I say that is because you, as a security practitioner, need to understand the security risk of everything that's in your digital ecosystem from top to bottom. And so the best way to do that is to inventory your assets. Now, look, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to say we cover every single asset class in our environment because I can always define new asset classes. So you have to draw the line somewhere. But in an ideal world, you have the breadth of understanding of everything that's in your digital ecosystem to be able to make the smartest decisions on exposures that exist within those assets. So for me, I divide assets into asset classes. And I rattled off a number of those asset classes I typically see within exposure management platforms.
I think that that's a good overview because, I mean, at Nucleus, one of the things that we, chime in a lot of times is an asset for us is like anything that can have a risk on it, anything that can have an exposure on it, just to generalize it and then, dig in based on a specific organization. But this is like a perfect segue into the next thing, which is, okay, we've talked about exposure management, like what it is, and what it's based on. But when you went out and asked, there are certain challenges that rose to the top. So, let's double click into those for a bit.
Yeah, for sure. So within the research that we did, 71% of those that we surveyed reported risk reduction is getting more difficult year over year, or in this particular case, over the last 2 years. They're increasing investment, yet it's harder to do. And so we dug into that a little bit and we asked why it's harder to do. And really it comes down to a few things. One is the nature of cloud and the cloud adoption curve accelerating, bringing in assets that are ephemeral in nature, that are transitory, that don't stay there, that go up and go down and are difficult to manage because they're not always there, right? So the cloud impact was real. It was a pretty drastic impact on making threat and exposure management more difficult. It's also not a traditional asset, right? It's not a server or a firewall or a router that you can stick a piece of hardware on. So we've had to rethink of how we manage and secure that environment. The second thing that is making life harder day to day for threat and exposure management people or cybersecurity people in general is the alert flood, the overwhelming alert count. And the reality here is that we have so many tools, and this gets to the next point as well, so many unique, disconnected, bespoke tools that have been designed in cybersecurity from the ground up to find as many issues as possible. And that's awesome because we need to enumerate those issues. We need to figure them out, find out what they are so that we can fix them. The problem is we have not had nearly enough innovation on the execution of fixing the problem. So what's happened is a compounding security debt that builds. We put one tool in two, three, four, 10, and some enterprises have as many as 60 or 70 cybersecurity tools based on our analysis. And when you have that compounding tool set, all finding things that need to be fixed, you just get buried and you throw up your hands and you give up. And many enterprises simply say, we're just going to secure the severity one problems. That's it. We're not going to touch anything else. And some even go as far as to say we're going to cherry pick the Sev ones and only do the ones that we can fix quickly, right? And so too many alerts, too many disconnected bespoke tools, and the impact of cloud adoption have really made it harder over the last 2 years to actually reduce risk.
So basically, what you're describing is we've got cloud, which is an environment that was designed for scalability, elasticity, great IT stuff, but are making life much harder for security. And then on top of that, we've done a phenomenal job, and we keep doing a really good job at surfacing or discovering more and more stuff. But that's just the first half of the problem. The actual problem is not, just how to find them, but like the now what. And if we go into the next slide, this one actually surprised me, because we know the challenges, but when you look at what is the reality of security today, to me, this was a bit worrying, just, as an industry.
Yeah. Yeah. We asked the survey participants how often they are able to complete a total threat and exposure management analysis loop in their environment, meaning how often can you look at all of your asset base and say, we know the exposures, we're working on the exposures, we have a complete exposure list that we are burning down. And the response is basically that 80% of them, when you combine annual, quarterly, monthly, 80% of the respondents basically do monthly at best, right? Many of them do worse. 36% monthly, 38% once a quarter. And it used to be like, you had to have your annual pen test, and I'm sure this plays into it to a degree. But look, attackers are weaponizing exploits and are weaponizing and finding exposures in a fully automated way today already, to the point where you're talking not months or years before issues become a massive risk, but minutes or maybe hours, or okay, worst case scenario, days, when you have an exposure available for them to be exploited. So if you're only looking at your environment once a month and the attackers are able to attack it with a frequency that's on the order of hours, minutes, or days, there's no way you'll keep up. There's no way you can reduce risk fast enough. And so this goes to the continuous word when we talk about continuous threat and exposure management. It's finding a way to have an understanding of your asset base, your exposure base, and the threats against those exposures continuously, such that when they change, you know it and you fix the problem immediately.
So I think there's a saying that, we're always prepared for the last war, but in this case, the gap that we're seeing here is even more pronounced, because we live in a world where every day, we know that the gap between, exploit POC to actual exploits is shrinking. And, we know the race is on with each and every one of them. And yet we see this kind of gap, in coverage. And just as, alarming as the 80%, the other side of the spectrum is only 3% of the respondents are actually doing continuous scanning today. And I think we'll go a bit deeper into the whys of this, like why is this happening, or why aren't we doing better? But before that, the next issue that I do think is worth discussing is around prioritization, because volume and frequency really lead into prioritization as the core tool.
Yeah.
That for how do you go from, a lot and unmanageable to focused, and this is, what needs action. So walk us through some of the findings here.
Yeah, that last slide was a little bit disheartening, and I'll be honest with you, this slide for me is a little bit disheartening as well. What I mean by that is, if you're looking at the results of this, you see that most organizations, if we look at the ones that lean here, 26% look at exploitability as the key factor to prioritize an exposure or a vulnerability to get it fixed, right? Is it exploitable? And that's awesome. You need to know that, right? 21% say, hey, what's the CVE level? What's the severity level? Because that's what I care about. 15% reachability. And it's like, okay, that's how we've been prioritizing it before. But what that doesn't take into account are the three things on the right here, which really center on context. When you look at the severity level of a particular CVE for a vulnerability, it gives you a number, a result, right? That does not take into account the context of your environment. The particular target is what is the business impact of that target? Is there additional mitigating factors in my environment, in my infrastructure that lower that risk? And so the reality here is what I would love to see is some of these bars on the right, in particular, asset specific context or potential business impact, gaining in traction against exploitability and severity level. We can't ignore exploitability, severity level, and reachability. These are key, important, very important items, but we should always be creating our prioritization queue within context of our business. If a situation in a Sev1 issue exists on a completely isolated server that has no data and no ability to go from hop to hop, it's no longer a risk, even though it's a CVE Sev1, right? So I think that's one of the biggest problems we have with prioritization today is it's too narrowly focused.
To me, this slide almost translates as, from bad to worse, because as you indicated, exploitability is the highest bar. But another way of reading it is only 1 in 4 organizations
Yeah.
actually look at exploitability, which is the biggest threat factor out of your 3 pillars. Threat is one of those 3, and then the latter part kind of like builds into something that you've brought up multiple times now, in cloud and the asset context, but that is, it seems that under like bringing in asset context, business context into a prioritization framework is something that as an organization, as like an industry, we're doing a really, really bad job on.
Yep. Yeah, I agree completely. And that's, I mean, really what it comes down to is getting to a contextual approach. Problem is it's not human scalable, Tally. It's, to be able to look at all of this information is very, very difficult for a human. So like if I gave a human a particular exploit, vulnerability, not exploit, exposure, and said, prioritize this for me, what are they going to do? They're going to say, okay, what's the business impact of that particular server? They're going to look it up on some tool. What's the, the risk context? Do I have a mitigating factor in there? They'll do a bunch of research and they'll come back and go, it's a problem or it's not, right? Like they can classify it better that way. How do you do that when you're hit with a complete overload of alerts and you have to do it on every single alert? It's not human scalable. That's the problem.
And I think that leads us into the next pod, but just as an anecdote, at Nucleus, we have a strategic partnership with Mandiant, who's now Google Services. And one of the things that they do is come in post-exploit, post-breach, to help companies build up their security posture and security program. And I was speaking to one of our champions there, and we were regularly brought in as a solution in those cases. And I was asking him, okay, a breach has happened, and how do you tie this in? So why is Nucleus being recommended as part of that remediation process? And what he told me is like, it's going to be about vulnerability management, exposure management, but that's not the first step. The first step is that as soon as, most companies have really lacking CMDBs, if at all. And then asset inventories and assets information is scattered all over different scanning tools that they have. And as soon as, these sources are plugged into Nucleus, the first thing that comes out is we generate a unified asset inventory. And that is, a first step to managing at scale. As you said, there's no way to do this manually. If you're going to try and triage this information, using Excel sheets, that's not going to scale. But that's like the perfect step into the next slide, which is what is holding us back, right? We said we have a non-human scale problem, but why aren't we moving forward? What's holding us back?
Yeah, it's a combination of things as you see on this slide, right? And you'll see in a later slide a little bit more data depth here, but the first thing is that it's a manual process. As I mentioned, humans can't process it fast enough. Humans are the best at processing it, right? We have logic, we have the ability to understand context, we have the ability to, um, make leaps from data point to data point and dig into data and get to the context that matters. But that's time sensitive, right? When you can't do it on a manual process. When you couple that with, okay, historically, many enterprises have said, okay, it's a manual process. Let's automate it. Let's create a system of automation. We're seeing a prevalence of DIY systems popping up here, do it yourself versions of this human process, right? So historically, we would say, well, let's take some information that we can get from our endpoint system and at least get a list of IP addresses that we have, and hit some alerts and try to find ways to build this connective tissue and context in a DIY manner. But that's hard. It's a very difficult problem to solve, and it's very expensive to do at a human level. And we'll dig into a little bit more data on that in a minute. But the biggest problem is that we're just not adopting platforms, and we're having all these bespoke tools as security people, enterprise security people, and we're just taking context switching constantly as we go from tool to connect this data point to that data point. And a platform could be so much more powerful in surfacing connected data points into context for us in an automated way. So I think the enterprise buyer recognizes a need for this. They just still haven't gotten to the point where they're massively adopting these platforms. And it's growing, it's coming, and I think they recognize that it's needed. But this is what's holding us back today.
So I think everyone will agree with manual processes. I mean, we've been discussing Excels forever.
Hmm.
I think the prevalence of DIY is something that I was surprised about, as I was with a low platform adoption. So the next slide really unpacks a ton of this, which is when people, when we say DIY, what are people trying to do, what they're looking to, and what are some of the issues that they're coming up against. And then once we
Yep.
figure that one out, we can go to the second part, which is why aren't people adopting platforms?
Yeah, the DIY data fabric one's the interesting, real fast on that one. Um, we're going to pull everything into our SIM platform or our CMDB, and we're going to try to make all these connections work with our versions of contextual overlays and data point context. And that's kind of where the DIY fabric started from, right? And then they said, okay, what's a better way to do this? Well, let's take a data platform like, I don't know, a Snowflake or something like that, and start dumping all of our cyber stuff in there and find ways to do business analytics on it. And I think the reality there is that the hard part is your data quality, right? So it turned into a dumping ground of data, which kind of helped, right? Because your security team could go to a single place and sift through the data they needed, but they had to understand how to query that data, how to look at structured data, how to look at unstructured data. Um, and data quality was a big problem. And if they tried to do it right and normalize that data and get that data to a uniform, accessible context, uh, that's a very, very difficult problem to solve in and of itself, right? Is normalization, deduplication, and getting a data set that's viable and useful. It's one of the hardest problems to solve. And so because of that, we ran into significant technical limitations around the data, right? Uh, reporting was hard, querying was hard, asking questions was hard. And it's difficult to get data in, it's difficult to normalize it, and it's difficult to find value from it when you're building it yourself. That's why vendors do it, right? Because there's a value proposition here that they can provide to customers to make their lives easier.
Um, what you're saying really resonates with what we're seeing, because a lot of the times, we're up against a DIY approach rather than a competitor. Um, but a lot of our customers, are very forward thinking. They're technical experts.
Hmm.
Why? I mean, I know our answer, which is definitely not, it's definitely a biased one, but why aren't, yeah, like if, high technology type of, technology savvy firms and AI, like if they're put their mind to it, why aren't they succeeding? Or why are so few succeeding? Because what we do
Yeah,
see
yeah.
consistently is, you know, if there's a head to head with a DIY, 6 to 9 months later, we will be talking to them again once they realize, just how painful it is.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's exactly what's happening, right? They many companies do have the skill set to build this. They do, except it's really hard. It's probably 2, 5, 10 times the amount of human resources you would have thought you needed. You have to pay significant costs to store the data, analyze the data, correlate the data, deduplicate, normalize the data. And when you break down the ROI of building it yourself and managing it, which is generally not the core competency of your company, it's, something that you're doing in addition to your day-to-day workload, you quickly realize it's expensive. It's too expensive to build, right? So let's go to a company that's figured out how to build it, use it en masse, and maintain it for us and create the outcomes we're looking for. So we can have the outcomes without all of that resource ingestion up front.
I think one thing you didn't mention as much as it's not a once and done. Like
Oh yeah,
in
ongoing maintenance. Ongoing
it,
maintenance is very, very expensive.
even the small things like integrations with different any tools that you're ingesting, they are moving forward, which means their APIs are changing, which means you need to do a reintegration. It'll
Yep.
break, and you need to make sure that you're really, really quickly, and you have that partnership to make sure that you are integrating in time or reintegrating time. So even small things like that, and this is beyond, before we go into, well, now we also want to protect against AI agent, you know, using their identity improperly, whatever it is, new attack surface, new thing that you're going to want to cover. So like every tool, like every platform, there is ongoing maintenance work that is not just, the day-to-day maintenance, but the innovation and
Mm.
development, just to make the thing, usable, not just today, but moving forward. But okay, so we kind of like double clicked into and discuss why not DIY. But the second part of that same question is why aren't more companies,
Yep.
adopting a platform?
Yep. So they go through the DIY challenge, whether they realize it up front that it's going to be expensive and go and say, hey, we'll go get a platform, or they come back 6, 9, 12 months later and go get a platform. They eventually realize that the need is there. But what holds them back from purchasing and moving forward is 49% site integration complexity, 47% site and overall implementation burden. And this is because that process is difficult, right? You have to integrate with all your ingestion points, all your data sets, both cyber data sets, IT data sets, even potentially human resources data sets if you want to start doing identity level asset analysis, right? So depending on the breadth of the analysis you're trying to roll out, the platform has to do a lot of integration and implementation. So what you want to look for as a buyer is companies and platforms that focus on solving those problems as well. Not just that, give you better prioritization because their context is richer, which is super important, but can you deploy it? Can you maintain it? Will it stay up? Right. And pushing on your platform vendor in those areas, especially when evaluating a TEM platform, is very, very important to the decision. So right now, 26% of those surveyed use some kind of threat and exposure management platform. Um, we believe that's huge, ample growth opportunity in the market for vendors in the market. And that's why we're seeing so many vendors enter this space or push forward in this space. But to do it right, you have to make it easy. And so user experience, ease of adoption, ease of integration, ease of implementation are all going to be massive differentiators in which platforms do well over time.
One thing that I think is also, as companies are considering, TEM platform adoption, is the vast difference between a shiny looking POV or demo and what it takes to scale these kind of solutions, because exactly the same as the DIY, there is a perception of ease, and sometimes getting, a first thing that's working kind of like, in a demo in a very limited environment is one thing. Scaling it in complex enterprises is a completely other story.
Yeah. Yeah, I would definitely advise customers of threat and exposure management platform to be well scoped as they roll out their first iterations of this. Scope it to asset classes that you can do integrations for, and then expand over time as you add additional integrations, additional asset classes, additional context into that environment.
All right, we've talked a lot about what's wrong. And I think there is an agreement that there's a lot that, should be done better. We sort of have, the overarching answer that we're going to get into around AI. But a minute before we do that, kind of like summarizing a lot of what has been brought up is that we talk about risk reduction or this entire thing as a almost like a discrete operation that starts with, we've got a finding and we need to fix, right? And yes, we will add prioritization in the middle. I think one of the reasons that there is such a prevalence of DIY, one of the reasons that people are looking at it not necessarily strategically as a holistic platform, is because when you start breaking this down, there are probably 75 to 100 different processes that are happening in sequence across different types of tools, different types of teams, to get you from here's a list of things that I found to here's the risk that I fixed. And the reason I'm kind of like bringing this discussion up as we're going into AI is because we're hearing about AI is going to solve everything. And I want, as I click into the next slide, I think this is a context that's worth, basing the discussion on. It's not just what AI can do, it's what AI needs to succeed. So when you looked at this, you actually analyzed some of the key spaces, that are being addressed by AI. So let's dive into those first. And then what does this actually need to work?
Yeah, so if we start talking about AI's impact on threat and exposure management, I think there's a tactical way to talk about it, and then I think there's a slightly elevated version of the discussion, right? The tactical way is, look, we can create automated AI, agentic AI that goes around your infrastructure and your ecosystem and finds everything and ingests things and analyzes things and pulls that in. And then we can create agentic contextual analysis. And then we can create agentic prioritization processes and agentic even remediation and self-healing systems, right? And that's kind of the tactical answer to that, right? Is to look at the entire cycle of a threat and exposure management process and apply AI throughout. And I love that. I talk about that all the time. But I think one of the things I really like about what you have on this slide is it elevates it just a touch, right? It's all about reducing risk better. There's only two things. What I've found in all of my talking to customers or potential prospects or security people in general, there's only two things that they really want. Well, three. We'll call it three. One is something that works well, is easy to use, but I think that's kind of implied, right? The two things that they really, really want are the ability to prioritize in context what needs to be done. Give me the list of things pertinent to me that's contextually enriched by my environment and shows me exactly what needs to be done and how to do it, right? Boom. That's number one. The other thing that they want is fixing problems faster. It's very simple. I have a list of 100,000 exposures, vulnerabilities that need to be remediated. How do I get that down to zero as quickly as possible so that I'm not only doing a full CTEM loop once a month or once a quarter or once a year, right? And so those are the two things that they really want. AI is 100% directly involved in both of those capabilities strongly, right? So ingestion of data, as I mentioned on the tactical description, ingestion of data, correlation of data, understanding how your context fits in, that's all contextual, right? That's all building the context. AI is great at that. AI is great at what humans do when they start pulling data pieces together and providing enriched context. That's what AI is really good at. So I think that at that level, it's going to help significantly. That results directly in better prioritization because we have an understanding of our environment and make smarter decisions like a human would do. But it's instead of taking a day, 2 days, or a week to analyze a exposure and say this one's a lower priority or higher priority than these other ones, it can be done in seconds, minutes, right? Boom, we know. So that speed is the most important thing that AI is going to bring to the table, that speed of execution. And then on that last side, is automated remediation. And I'm kind of getting ahead on this one, so I'm going to hold off discussing automated remediation for a slide that we have a little bit further down. But suffice it to say that AI will have a direct piece of that as well. So AI enhanced TEM, business risk reduction, exposure management, asset intelligence, data collection, and threat intelligence, connecting that threat data to the richness of your context. That's exactly what AI is going to be very, very good at.
So we're almost looking at this as, you've got the whole process. Let's start digging into specific areas, as vendors, as an industry, where bringing in AI can speed things, can make things, scale better, how do we drive risk-based decisions, faster, smarter? The next slide actually takes it a bit further into the future, which is
Yeah.
not just how we should be thinking about it now, but let's look forward just a bit. And how do you see this playing out, in the broader left of boom, right of boom context?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a concept I got from Sunil Yu, a good friend of mine. He talks about left of boom, right of boom 4 years ago. He was teaching me about this kind of stuff. Um, Conceptually, you can think of left of boom as before an attack or a breach occurs, and right of boom is post breach, right? So boom occurs, what do we do now? And traditionally, we've thought of exposure management as left of boom problem, right? We're looking at exposures, we're fixing them as quickly as possible, prioritizing them, and burning down the risk chart before things happen. And that's awesome. That's where we want to be, right? That's the result we want to be. But things get really interesting when you start to merge right of boom data and context with left of boom data and context. So take, for example, a breach occurs. We now have increased intelligence about what's risky in our environment, what an attacker did to execute that breach, what they might be looking for, how did they do lateral movement from system to system, what identities were attacked, how did they get elevated privileges? All of that information, when fed back to left of boom, can make your prioritization even richer than before. So I think we're going to see a merging of technologies and products over time that handle left of boom and right of boom. And those two rich context capabilities will start to merge into a singular risk reduction type of context. Conversely, left of boom data in right of boom scenarios is massively important too, right? Because you get to know what exposures existed, where they were within the remediation cycle, things like that. So I think I'm just starting to hear it today. I think this is a bit of a predictive slide and future looking slide. But I think connecting the context points, these contextual points, is going to be so powerful over time.
I think we are seeing the beginning of this in the market, and again, just as an example, being able to identify um, exploitable risks in your environment, that, for example, you do not have good compensating controls on. Just being able to feed that information into your SOC and being able to tell them, take any IOCs, any indications of compromise on these more seriously, because we know this is a real exposure, is, even that kind of prioritization, or, feeding that to a pen testing team, just being able to more
Hmm.
proactively prioritize and contextualize what you're doing improves it. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Um, I think the next slide, which we talked about, you kind of like mentioned, but we have a poll first. So we're going to stop for a second and please take your poll. We're going to give you a minute just to answer. And then we'll tell you why we're even asking this, at this point on, in the presentation. So we're seeing people answering.
Yeah, this is a good question, right? And two, I do want you to think a little bit when we're talking about automated patching, think of not just patching a vulnerability, but actually decreasing risk, right? Think of automation of exposure reduction too.
Which brings mitigating controls in, which is,
A lot of
it's
things.
an
Yep.
entire discussion of what and how, but mitigating controls, unlike remediation, a lot of times are within the power of the security teams.
Hmm.
Which sometimes make it, again, depending on the organization, sometimes make it easier to do. And the ability to reduce risk from a, burning fire to a lower priority is also what allows you to then go and fix by group, do more productive remediation type of campaigns rather than trying to do everything as a fire drill, which is
Yep.
disruptive and very high cost to the organization. All right, so I think
Absolutely.
we've got quite a few. Let's share the results. So you should be seeing the results of the poll, and what we're seeing is that starting from nothing, no one, we're not going to automate patching at all. There is no one who's doing 100% automated patching. It's interesting. And we're going to automate on the majority of systems or on a few critical systems.
Yeah.
What we didn't ask and should have is how many are actually doing this on like dev and staging. So not the criticals, maybe, production we're not
Yep.
good about. But so how do I move this out? What move?
Yep.
Hopefully. No, it doesn't like this. This, got it. So the reason we asked you as we go into this is that one of the questions that where the answer surprised me the most is the question of, how many organizations, and I'm probably not wording precisely, but are, are in or want autonomous remediation. And 94% said yes. And I was like, wow, think back just to like automated patching, which is autonomous, very, very, very light, right?
Hmm.
This is like a gap between what we're willing to do and what people want. So
Yep.
let's break that down a bit.
Yeah. No, you identified it perfectly, right? Like when I talk to a security person, I say, "Hey, do you want a system that fixes itself, in real time?" Almost exclusively, they say yes. Because why wouldn't you, right? If you have a backlog of 100,000 exposures that you need to burn down, and you have a team of 4 people, and you do the math on the average exposure time it takes to reduce one exposure, and you're looking at a 30 to 40 year backlog of risk reduction to get to zero risk, not including finding new stuff over those 30 to 40 years, you realize you're dead. So of course people want automation here, right? It's a scale problem and a speed problem. So I'm not shocked that 94% say yes to automation. What's really the reality though is they're scared of it. That's really what it comes down to. They're saying, hey, I'm scared that if I allow automated remediation to occur for these exposure classes, you'll take down my system that's making money. You'll take down my travel system. You'll take down my sales system. You'll break my business. And it's interesting, I've been around the block a bit, and I remember when automated updates for Windows came out. This is in the 90s. People freaked out. They're like, I will never, ever allow automated update to my endpoints because it's going to break stuff and it's going to take my employees offline. Absolutely never will happen. Now, the vast majority of people say, yeah, go ahead. Just make sure you update it tonight or within the next 2 days, right? And sure, they may run a test or two to make sure it's not going to break stuff, but they pretty much roll that out fully automated today, right? We're having a similar knee-jerk reaction to automated remediation concepts. They're just scared of it. And so what's going to happen in the near term is they'll find subsets of systems. Let's do it on dev only, or yeah, on pre-prod only, or QA, or let's do it just on a subsection of our endpoints and automate the remediation on 10% first. And that's fine. That's the right way to build trust with these systems. But I think what you're going to find is we start to layer AI into the equation, and AI gives you recommended steps. Here's the 10 steps to fix this exposure. And your security analyst looks at it and goes, "Hey, that context is awesome. It's perfect. Every single step is literally exactly right." Click, 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 makes it happen. On to the next one. Same flaw class, same result. Same flaw class, same result. All of a sudden, that analyst goes, "Hey, 999 times out of 1,000, this has been perfect. Let's check that box that says auto remediate for this class of vulnerability. Not for everything. We won't see a mass adoption of fix the world, go. But what we will see is class by class trust building over time, and things will start to remediate faster and faster. And you'll watch that exponential growth curve on your exposures start to slow down and eventually start to actually decrease as we automate more and more of remediation capabilities.
But just to sum up what you just said, because I think this is probably one of the most important points, it's yes, we want automated remediation. The path to doing that is unfortunately taking a strategic approach where you identify the subcategories, the subclasses of where we want to try this, where we are willing to, whether again it's a type of exposure that is less risky, whether it's a type of infrastructure, the dev prod discussion, which is less risky. And then once we strategically identify these, the next step is building trust with
Yep.
an automated process where over time we will be confident enough to say, all right, we can expand this or we can make it fully automated. But even in the meantime, we should be gaining, the advantages of getting more intelligence, step-by-step information to help us, to guide us forward. So it's not like,
Yep.
it's not a zero nothing. It's like, it's a direction, not perfection approach. It's let's go in the right direction. And over time that will move us forward to where we want to go.
Yeah.
But,
Yep.
in hindsight, yes, the 94, it's almost like the question, well, what happened to the last 6%? Why aren't they on board with this? But we've reached the end, and there's, we've gone through a lot here. Just looking at, as you're going to the summary of what we covered, I'm assuming, some of our audience, and we saw some of this is, they are in DIY phase, or they are probably in, shockingly still, with Excels. How do you, as someone who's been on both sides of the fence, like, how would you advise people to even think about starting to move forward? What should they be doing?
Yeah, the number one thing that they should be thinking about is automation and speed. That's literally the number one thing, because if they automate and they find ways to create automations to increase the speed of data collection, analysis, and remediation, that's how they're going to get better at burning down the risk chart, right? So, in particular, I would say evaluate threat and exposure management platforms, particularly those that have an AI product roadmap, right? Or product or roadmap in general around AI, and start to say, where within my manual processes can I use this capability? Can I use this platform? And maybe it starts with just, hey, I'm going to bring in endpoint data, I'm going to bring in cloud risk data, and I'm going to bring in some identity data, and we're going to burn down those risks first. Maybe it's a smaller bite and not, hey, let's bring everything into the platform and try to redo our entire processes from scratch. And what you're going to find is over time, you'll continue to extend and expand the data you collect, the context you have, the remediations that come out the other side. And you're going to build that at the same time that the platform is becoming more automated, finding better ways to create faster speed to remediation for you. And so don't try to boil the ocean. Definitely look at platforms because you're going to find the cost and recurring cost and maintenance and everything is way lower in a purchase platform. Evaluate them and then look at the priorities, right? To align your risk reduction metrics with the adoption of the platform, right? So not just, we're only looking at Sev 1. One story I asked somebody the other day was if I could put you into a threat and exposure management platform that reduced or got rid of all of your Sev 5, your bottom, you're like, we're never going to touch them because they're not really risky problems. And it took you from 100,000 exposures down to 500. Would that make your board happy? Well, yeah, right. We reduced a ton of risk here. But the interesting thing about that is we're able to do that automatically. And so look for systems that have automations and speed because at the same time, you're reducing risk on those very high ones too. You might be able to automate risk reduction broadly and fast. So get off DIY, look for ways to get onto platforms, look for platforms that are focused on AI, speed, automation, and fixing things fast.
Okay, that sounds good. Be mindful of time because we are almost at the top of the hour. This went really fast. Like, yes, I know I can keep asking you questions forever. I do want to reiterate, go and download the full report because there's a ton of stuff that we didn't get into. And just as timely, looking at, our next webinar in the series is about AI-powered exposure management. Nucleus, interestingly enough, was founded, and we're not allowed to say this because it's not necessarily politically correct, but it was founded to automate the vulnerability analyst. That's, our founders, this is what they did. They felt the pain and they were like, there's got to be a way to automate it. And I think looking into AI powered and how that plays with automation, a lot of powering AI is automated processes that have to happen underneath that are not agentic or AI or anything, they are automation. And when you're powering AI with the right automation, foundation, with the right data foundation, your ability to, get outcomes and trusted, repeatable processes is that much better. And that's what we'll be diving into. So here's a QR code. Take a minute and, register to our next webinar. And Tyler, any parting remarks?
Yeah, definitely sign up for this webinar. I'm going to come and watch it because I love that concept. AI powered exposure management. Look, analysts, don't be afraid. AI is not gonna hurt you.
Oh, yeah, no.
I have a lot of thoughts around what's going to happen to the analysts. And the cool thing about analysts is you're going to go from doing individual task level items to orchestrating an army of people that are computerized people to get stuff done. And that transition is going to be super fun and exciting. So I'm going to come on this one to learn myself. And yeah, I'm looking forward to viewing it.
So thank you everyone for joining. It's been a pleasure as always, Tyler. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Tally. It's been a pleasure.